Okay, close your eyes for just a second. I want you to imagine the deep, totally immersive sounds of a dense, treacherous jungle. The sudden snap of a twig, the distant, echoing roar of a predator. You've got literally life or death stakes waiting behind every massive fern and towering teak tree. In this world, I would rather live 2 days like a tiger than 200 years like a sheep. Those words, famously spoken by Tipu Sultan, perfectly capture the desperate, defiant, and just incredibly fierce spirit of early Indian anti-colonial resistance. Today, we are exploring a story of absolute defiance.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly cinematic, high-energy narrative all about asymmetric guerrilla warfare against towering global empires. We're going to look at how small, tight-knit bands of fiercely loyal fighters use the landscape itself to hold massive, heavily armed colonial forces at bay for decades. Seriously, the sheer tactical genius we're about to uncover is absolutely going to blow you away.
Section 1. The Lion's Jungle. Let's dive right in.
So we are transporting ourselves to the lush, mountainous, and honestly nearly impenetrable terrain of Wayanad in the late 18th century. Now, this isn't just a forest. We're talking about a fortress made of wood, rock, and rain. And at the absolute core of this story is Pazhashi Raja. He was widely known as the Lion of Kerala. As a young prince, when everyone else fled, he stayed put. And what you really should take away from this is the sheer impossibility of his situation. I mean, he waged a 14-year guerrilla war against not one, but two towering empires. First, he took on the sprawling forces of the Kingdom of Mysore, and then the relentless, grinding machinery of the British East India Company. He was essentially a lone, defiant figure standing squarely in the path of massive, encroaching war machines.
Section 2. Clash of the Titans.
To truly wrap our heads around the bravery of these guerrilla fighters, we have to look at the terrifying scale of the conventional armies they were going up against. Imagine the deep bass of thousands of marching boots and the deafening crack of massed musket fire echoing right across the plains. There is a terrifying contrast in strategy here. On one side, you have conventional colonial warfare. We're talking massive, rigid lines of infantry and heavy artillery. But on the other side, the asymmetric tactics of our guerrilla heroes. They relied on extreme mobility, completely hidden forest forts, and a massive intelligence network made up entirely of local peasants. I mean, how do you shoot an enemy that simply melts back into the trees?
To give you a very specific idea of the technological terror these guerrillas faced, look at this number, 9,000. After the siege of Srirangapatna in 1799, the British found 9,000 empty rockets, alongside hundreds of launchers, inside Tipu Sultan's fort. This was terrifying, highly modernized military might. The British actually took these, reverse-engineered them, and used them against Napoleon later on. That is the level of firepower that fighters like Pazhashi Raja had to constantly evade. They weren't just fighting men, they were fighting the absolute cutting edge of global military technology.
Section 3. The Kodiyati War.
So this brings us to a frankly legendary conflict, where one man essentially weaponized the entire Malabar landscape, turning every valley and mountain pass into a deadly trap. We call this the Kodiyati War. This was a fierce insurgent campaign lasting from 1793 to 1805. It was sparked by Pazhashi Raja, fiercely resisting British intervention and exorbitant tax collections in his kingdom of Kottayam. Now you might be wondering, why did the local people back him so strongly? Well, because he categorically refused to extort his own peasantry just to meet foreign revenue targets. He shared in their privations, and in return, they became his ultimate shield.
This was just an exhausting, decade-long struggle. It kicks off in 1793 with the very first revolt, hitting a massive high point for the resistance in 1797. But by 1801, the situation is so completely out of hand for the colonial forces that the British actually have to deploy an astonishing 10,000 troops just to hunt this one man down. And as we'll see, it culminates in a tragic final stand in 1805. Just think about the sheer endurance required to live out in the jungles, fighting a continuous, grinding war for over a decade.
Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer tactical brilliance of that 1797 victory at Peria Pass. It's just astounding. The British troops were suffering from severe supply shortages and were marching through a very narrow pass. Well, Pazhashi Raja knew their exact state. He didn't bother meeting them on an open field. Instead, he had his forces lie completely concealed in camouflage stockades built directly into the steep sides of the pass. When they finally sprang the trap, a huge British force was utterly decimated. The terrain itself literally became the weapon.
Section 4. A Subcontinent in Shadows.
While the Lion of Kerala fought down in the south, primary sources show that resentments were brewing broadly across the entire subcontinent. By the mid-19th century, deep dissatisfaction over economic extortion, cultural friction, and just a total disregard for local customs, like the infamous greased cartridges issue, well, it really set the stage for the massive 1857 rebellion. It's vital to look at this impartially. The colonial push to aggressively standardize and extract wealth created an environment where widespread, desperate resistance just became inevitable.
And those brewing resentments, they exploded in 1857. Historical accounts of the capture of Gwalior and the tragic battle at Kodaki Sarai describe the incredibly high-stakes campaigns of figures like Tatya Tope and the Rani of Jhansi. They faced the exact same overwhelming odds as Pajasi Raja did, and they adopted very similar, highly mobile survival tactics to keep the rebellion alive against the massive British columns.
Actually, even British generals were in absolute awe of their adversaries. Sir Hugh Rose, who directly fought against her, called the Rani of Jhansi the bravest and best military leader of the rebels. Historical accounts note her legendary bravery, describing her fighting fiercely with a sword in both hands while guiding her horse with the reins clenched in her teeth. I mean, it's just an incredible image of defiance that echoes that exact same tiger-like spirit we talked about right at the beginning of this explainer.
Working right alongside her was Tatya Tope, who essentially wrote the manual on 19th century Indian guerrilla warfare. His principles were just ruthlessly pragmatic. Rule number 1, avoid face-to-face combat at all costs. Rule number 2, attack the enemy from the back, constantly harassing their massive supply trains. And rule number 3, swiftly mobilize rich local landlords for cash and resources, which allowed his army to move fast without heavy baggage.
The result of these principles was a level of extreme mobility that completely bewildered the British. While the colonial armies were heavily burdened by massive tents, heavy artillery, and extremely slow-moving supply lines, Tatya's forces carried almost nothing. They moved like ghosts, striking swiftly and then vanishing right back into the landscape before the British could even form their lines.
We see this exact same brilliance further south with Sangoli Rayana in Kittur. Following the capture of his queen, Rani Chennamma, Rayana took to the dense forests. He brilliantly utilized the intelligence of local Kuruba pastoralists. These were people who knew every single hidden trail and watering hole to constantly evade capture. He waged a devastating campaign of ambushes, systematically disrupting colonial supply lines and just completely frustrating the local British administration.
Section 5. The Anatomy of Betrayal.
So, think about it. If these guerrilla fighters were so deeply embedded in the terrain, if they were so fiercely loved by their people, and if their tactics were so far superior, how do you defeat an enemy you cannot see? Well, the answer lies in the strategic colonial playbook of divide and rule. When conventional armies failed, colonial administrators pivoted to psychological and economic warfare. Step 1. Exploit pre-existing local vulnerabilities and family rivalries. Step 2. Offer massive land grants and huge monetary rewards to a desperately poor populace. Step 3. Coerce collaboration. Slowly but surely, they bought the eyes and ears of the forest.
The really crucial point here is that these incredible uprisings were almost never defeated by sheer military might. No, they were defeated by the tragic reality of internal betrayal. Sangoli Rayana was ultimately ambushed and captured because his own uncle, Lakshman Raya, was induced by the British to give up his location. And Pajasi Raja faced the exact same fate, cornered only after a local informant, driven by the promise of colonial money, led British troops directly to his secret camp.
Section 6. The Ultimate Sacrifice.
This brings our story full circle, right back to the deep, damp jungles of Wayanad in the late autumn of 1805. The colonial net, woven entirely from betrayal and relentless pursuit, was finally closing in on the Lion of Kerala. On November 30, 1805, acting on that purchased intelligence, a detachment led by British sub-collector Thomas Hervey Baber launched a sudden, surprise ambush at a stream called Mavila Todu. The fight was incredibly intense, but it was very short. And it was there, amidst the chaotic crack of musket fire in the jumble, that the Lion of Kerala finally fell.
But even in his final moments, you guys, his spirit never broke. Historical accounts suggest that as he lay there mortally wounded, an East India Company official approached him. Pajasi Raja, with his last breaths, raised his gun and uttered these chilling words, "Do not come too close to my dying body and pollute it." It was just an absolute, unwavering display of contempt for those who collaborated with foreign invaders. He remained completely unshakable, defiant to the very bitter end.
We started this explainer talking about living 2 days like a tiger, rather than 200 years like a sheep. And these men and women embodied that to their very core. But I want to leave you with this really provocative thought as we wrap up. If these brilliant terrain-mastering guerrilla rebellions were fundamentally defeated by internal betrayal and paid informants, rather than on the actual battlefield, how entirely different would world history look today if those networks of solidarity had never broken? Thank you so much for joining me to